Welcome to STEPS, a staff training program run by the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University. Greetings to you. My name is Tara Brabazon and I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University. And welcome to this training session for supervisors on the PhD by prior publication. This is a mode of doctorate that is certainly small in numbers, but is ongoing and quite fascinating in terms of its growth. It is coming from a small base, but it will be an area that will expand in diverse disciplines in the years to come. So to confirm, there are 5 modes of PhD: the traditional thesis, the professional doctoral suite, like the Doctorate of Public Health or the Doctorate of Education. We've got the artefact and exegesis thesis, the PhD by prior publication, and the PhD by publication. Each of these modes of doctorate have a different history and a different trajectory in doctoral education. But the challenge is, and it's really impossible, if I'm honest, this isn't a challenge, this is something that's impossible, is to try and create a culture of equivalence between them. So this short training session, delivered by podcast, focuses on the PhD by prior publication. Let me tell you a little bit about its history, and then we'll talk about the challenges with it and the specific skills and andragogy needed to supervise it. In 1992, and in the United Kingdom, the former polytechnics became universities. So Manchester Poly became Manchester Metropolitan University, Leeds Poly became Leeds Metropolitan University, and later Leeds Beckett. It was an industry-wide, a sector-wide movement, which required industry-wide policies, procedures, and quality assurance protocols. The CNAA, the Council of National Academic Awards, moved the polytechnics into the university system. Now, as you can imagine, there were a lot of challenges with that movement. One of those challenges was about the staff of the former polys, or indeed the new universities as they were described. You see, they were academics with long and pretty distinguished careers of teaching and research, but they frequently didn't have a PhD. Remember the times, the early 1990s. So this movement by the CNAA was aligned with movements in the doctoral space. The movement to the PhD by prior publication occurred so that that particular group of staff could gain their doctorate. So what would happen is they'd have their publications that were over a long period of time, bundle them together, write an intro and an outro, and yes, create a PhD. So this was highly controversial, and of course I have an insider's view of this movement because my beloved late husband, Steve Redhead, was a member of the CNNA. And the committees assessing them discussed and explored some publications and whether those publications would be equivalent to a PhD. So if you think about the time, here's a collection of publications. Are they in any way, shape or form equivalent to spending 3 years doing a traditional PhD? Now, Steve at the time disagreed with it. He did, and many of us really still do, to be frank. But, water under the bridge. What number of articles would be equivalent to a PhD, and how do we handle authorship or co-authorship? How could originality ever be proven? And you think about it, some of this work may have been a decade or decades before, so it may have been innovative in 1978, but is it innovative now? So how would this mode of thesis ever be equivalent to 100,000 words written precisely around a specific topic for the purpose of researching and submitting a PhD? Because, as we all know, refereed articles have different aims, outcomes, audiences and points than a PhD. So this was a really crunchy moment of quality assurance for national systems of doctoral regulation. So we're here now, over a quarter of a century later, and the PhD by publication is here to stay. But as you can see, that original aim, that original goal has now dissipated. We have more people in doctoral programs around the world than at any point in the history of universities. And indeed, as we all know, when junior faculty, if I use the language from North America, or a lectureship post, if I use the Australian language, is advertised, way over 3/4 of the candidates at least already have a PhD, for the most junior of posts. So the original aim to ensure that experienced staff had a pathway to the doctorate that recognised their prior research, that goal, that imperative is gone. But the degree remains. And I've been watching it for the last decade or so, and some trends and some tendencies are emerging. What we're seeing the elite profession, so law and medicine, interestingly enough, start to dominate this enrolment. So men and women who have professional careers have published during those long professional careers, look back at their suite of publications and think, hello, there's a doctorate there. And you know what? There frequently is. But that's the dominant group, for example, that's enrolled at Flinders, particularly former medical practitioners. But recently I've been approached from a much wider group of men and women, interestingly from the United States, in diverse areas of the social sciences, linked with local government, public service, city planning. These men and women have a career and have article upon article upon article about urban development or transportation policy, and are inquiring if that mode of thesis would suit them. And yes, there is a mode of thesis that suits them, and it is the PhD by prior publication. So I think we might be on the cusp of this mode of doctorate expanding, which is why this training day and moment exists for you. And I think as baby boomers retire and wish to codify their career with a doctorate, we're going to see that group. But also successful professionals of my generation, Gen X, realising that, you know what, they've accumulated a lot of pretty high quality research doing their job, and perhaps it can be repurposed for a doctorate. So that's setting the scene. That's where we're sort of at. That's how we got here, and that's where we're at now. So let's talk about the shape of a PhD by prior publication. The PhD by prior publication has two parts. The contextual statement, that in some systems is also referred to as the integrating essay. So that's the first part, and then a selection of publications. The question is it possible to have published, say, 6 or 8 articles, bundle them together with a contextual statement, and get a PhD by prior publication? Well, yes, it is. But the candidate has to be lucky, and that luck is all the publications are nested into a particular cluster of knowledge, and therefore there is a story to tell about that research, about that scholarship, and yes, indeed, about the development of knowledge. And I'll just make the point here that this has been a big issue through the last 10 years of my life, really. Supervisors and students often ask about the number of articles required. Oh, wow. And look, there is no definitive list here. You need the number of articles that proves to examiners that an original contribution to knowledge has been made. So remember, you are rendering, as a supervisor, this thesis, this PhD by prior publication, as equivalent to 3 years of focused study. So it's not a matter about me giving you a number. You know, like when undergraduates say, well, how many references do I need for this essay? The question I always get in PhD by prior publications is, well, how many articles do I need to get this qualification? Look, there is no number. Like we tell our first year students, like I tell my PhD by prior publication students, there is no number. But for supervisors, this number is important because you have to determine whether or not there is enough scope and scale there to grant a PhD. So for supervisors, the real trick in this mode of PhD is risk management and risk mitigation. So for me, we select the articles that tell the story of the research. That's the key. They've got a cluster and there's got to be a story to tell. And that may be 6 to 8 articles. I think that's relatively safe. But it may be 20. So, for example, in some areas of the health sciences, the articles are shorter. They're making one particular point often. And so bundling them together, you know, in a greater number can create that clustering and that sense and productivity that is around originality. It does depend on the field or discipline. It's not a numbers issue, certainly, but do be aware, risk management. Do you think there's enough there to give it a PhD? So the most common mode of entry we see at Flinders, and we're seeing in medicine in particular, is for someone, who's had an incredibly distinguished career and they've got lots of publications, so 100 plus publications. So the first stage in the PhD by prior publication is the selection of articles. If a student has 8 articles and they're clustered and they're brilliant, then the supervisor and the student, will save a lot of time. But for the overwhelming majority of people coming into this program, a selection must be made. So how do you make that selection? Firstly, you've got to select the majority of papers where the student is the sole or first author. Now, I'm aware some disciplines that doesn't apply. Maths is the obvious example, but it must be the student's work that is being assessed. So if the student is the sole author, again, no problems, knock yourself out, thanks for playing. Right, if there is co-authorship, which in probably the majority of disciplines that exist outside of the humanities and the theoretical social sciences, that will be the case, then the student has a responsibility to prove to the examiners that this was their work, or the bulk of their work. And the students have to demonstrate in their integrating essay at the start, they have to confirm their contribution, if you will, to each and every article. That must be proven rather than assumed. And we see a lot of problems in this area when students put in every one of their publications, and there are a few where they are the third author. And examiners balk. We've seen it recently. Examiners balk and say, you know what? It's not their work. It's not enough of their work. I can't prove it's their work. So be aware of those risks. So firstly, we make a selection on authorship, then make a selection on content. And this is really where supervisors have strong oversight. So make sure that the content hangs together. So what we're after are articles, book chapters, conference proceedings, all sorts of objects that tell a research story. And that is, they slot together like jigsaw pieces. This discovery led to this, led to this, led to this, and this research story is my original contribution to knowledge. So students and supervisors need to select articles, and then they need to order them into a coherent story that emerges through these pieces. So that's the first job done. Get the selection in place and start to order them. Let's get ready to the tough bit now. And that is the writing of the contextual statement or the integrating essay. So what this statement must do is demonstrate the candidate's capacity to conduct original research. So this original research must be significant and different from the conventional PhD. The candidate is also being assessed via the proxy of the contextual statement. So that makes it quite different in a non-viva Australian PhD program, because really the candidate's also being assessed, who is this person and how has this research developed? Whereas I think the mix is different in the traditional thesis. It's much more the research on the page is being assessed. So the examiners want to know who this person is and where this stuff has come from. So to get this bit of the integrating statement, the contextual statement organised, I'll summon that old football chant. You know, who are you? Who are you? Who are you? Well, for the student, you've got to say, who are you? And why should we care? Where have the articles come from, and why do you think they're a PhD? And that's the contextual statement. For our newly emerging PhD by prior publications that seem to be coming from public policy and the social sciences, of course, this is a very interesting and easy component for you to write, of course, because who are you? This is what you've done. This is the impact. Thanks for playing. The next bit to worry about in the contextual statement is, and it's so hard, is demonstrating an original contribution to knowledge. This is quite challenging, as much of the work we're dealing with in this mode of PhD is historic. So it was original in 1994, what about now? So again, originality for a traditional PhD means slightly different things in the PhD by prior publication, particularly how the case has been made. The candidate shows how their research made an original contribution to knowledge by telling the story of the research. And wow, this bit is tricky. I won't pretend it's not. It is hard. It's like, as I said in another one of these training sessions about the creative-led PhD, The exegesis is really the deal breaker. It is the same as the traditional PhD, of course, just their bonsai theses. Everything in the original plant is there, it's just smaller. So with the PhD by prior publication, the trick and the challenge is to take these disparate pieces and through the contextual statement, link them. And that's really hard, and it's hard enough. But you then have to link them to prove originality. The publications do not speak for themselves. That's the risk for punters, that publications do not speak for themselves. Publications are not a PhD. Refereeing is not examination. The mistakes that are made in this mode of doctorate is when it is assumed by supervisors and students that the publications speak for themselves. And really in this mode, they do not. We all produce hundreds of refereed articles through our career, but only one PhD. So the student will have to demonstrate the originality, and don't assume that refereeing means anything at this point. This thesis will pass or fail on the contextual statement, just like creative-led theses will pass or fail on the exegesis. They are the mediator, the filter, the funnel for your research. You pick the metaphor that suits you and suits your students best, and the examiner has to see with full transparency the story of the research. And you can't be too overt in this section. So what is the context for each of these pieces? How do they develop? What was the research contribution in them? And how do they align to do something startling? So talk overtly in the contextual statement about each piece. Perhaps it could be the citations that the pieces have attracted, how the work has been used. You can go into impact, you can go into significance. And of course those words, impact and significance, vary enormously between disciplines. But the key general point is your student is going to have to prove originality. The key mistake that's made in this mode of doctorate, and we see it, it's just like a train wreck really. Articles are thrown together, no sense of ordering or relationship between them. And the contextual statement, and I have seen this on multiple occasions, is submitted with a collection of bullet points listing where the articles were published in the year and the citations, and that's it. And needless to say, every PhD by prior publication that has been formatted in that way has not passed. But if you make the case for the research and you orient the examiner into the student's research world, then we as supervisors have done our job. So my final few comments in this training session are about the PhD by prior publication more generally, and that's about what can be considered a publication, yeah? So firstly and obviously, the work must be published, so unpublished work cannot be considered. But in terms of the published work, and this is really important, through the history of the mode of this doctorate, refereed articles have dominated the submissions, not a doubt about it. But of course, scholarly monographs, chapters in books and exhibitions, conference proceedings, films, sonic artefacts can also be included. But what is frequently shunned, what is not part of this mode of doctorate, are the review articles, which I know is incredibly controversial in medicine and allied health, newspaper articles, articles in non-refereed professional journals, or, and this is important, work that has been successfully or unsuccessfully put into another degree. So this means, for example, and I did have one person that had a go at this actually in the UK, is they'd enrolled in a PhD, and I think they actually submitted it and it had failed. And then they had a go at moving it into articles for a PhD by prior publication, going for some pretty well dodgy articles at the end of our sector, shall we say, I'll be kind, and that was balked because it actually had the material had already come through for examination and it failed. So that's odd, but I do remember that case. Also, work where the candidate was an editor, that doesn't count in this mode either. So as you can pick up, presentation matters a lot in this mode of doctorate. In all doctorates, I think, students underestimate the role of presentation. The stuff is just thrown together. And, as we always try and say to all our students, think about your thesis from an examiner's perspective. Doesn't matter what the student thinks, doesn't matter what the supervisor thinks. What will the examiner think? And a messy, ill-ordered, error-ridden thesis unsettles the examiner, because problems with form can be a proxy for problems with content. For the PhD by prior publication, we as supervisors have to ensure that the student takes the time to ensure that the publications are gleaming. So they're a great version of the article, they're easy to read, we understand where they've come from, and it's looking good. And can I say that's increasingly challenging, and I've really seen it, but we will increasingly see it for, of course, open access refereed articles that exist online in the online mode. So if they are printed, and as we know, some of that printing looks a bit well dodgy. So finding strategies to ensure it looks clean on paper as much as it looks clean on the screen. Please do both, because we have digital examination, so it needs to look clean on the screen. But also rationally ordered, so the pieces must link together in some form. And that ordering, by the way, is not always chronological. That's quite significant, I think. The nature of publication, we all know some articles take 2 years to publish, some get through very, very quickly, and yet the ordering of the articles may not be chronological, and that's cool. Make sure that the ordering just simply makes sense. Then ensure that the contextual statement, the integrating essay, is beautifully written and conveys who the student is and their research ability, and look how these publications have come to be. Then nail the original contribution to knowledge. Be overt, be clear, make the case, don't assume the case. And that's how our students pass a PhD by prior publication. Enrolment is 6 months to 12 months, and our role as supervisors is very different, I think, from another mode of a doctorate. We are really the guides on the side here. Our job is intricate, though, ensuring that a case is well made and research that perhaps was never meant to integrate does link up. They are difficult but also really exciting theses to supervise. I always think they're like a jigsaw puzzle. I sort of love them because you sort of look at all these publications. I often put them all on the floor and we try and put it together like a jigsaw. So it is a really different type of supervision. It is supervision with a colleague. And this area will be expanding in enrolments, I think, and I think it will attract international students who may never visit Flinders or Australia, because there's no reason students need to come here. These conversations and consultations can be done via Skype, and these theses can be incredibly well supervised digitally, and I think are really well suited to digital doctorate andragogy. So if we are, as supervisors, are clear on our role at the moment of enrolment, then it's going to be a really successful, if brief, candidature. So thank you for joining me today for this sonic presentation, part of our STEPS program on the PhD by prior publication. Thanks for your time. Thank you for listening to this STEPS training program on behalf of the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University.